Chapter 1. You already know the feeling before you admit it to yourself. That tightness in your chest when she says something slightly off and then pretends it was nothing. That moment when you laugh it off in public but replay it later in private. You tell yourself you're overthinking. You tell yourself every relationship has rough edges. But there's a difference between friction and erosion. And if you're honest, you've felt erosion before. Disrespect rarely shows up dramatic at first. It doesn't kick the door in. It slides in quietly. It hides behind jokes. It hides behind mood swings. It hides behind, "That's just how I am." And because you don't want to be seen as insecure, you tolerate it. You adjust to it. You rationalize it. You convince yourself it's small. That right there is the beginning of the decline. A woman who consistently undermines you in subtle ways is not confused. She's calibrating what she can get away with. When she corrects you publicly in a tone that feels more like authority than partnership, when she dismisses your opinions with a smirk, when she challenges your decisions not to understand but to assert dominance, something is shifting. And the dangerous part is you feel it, but choose comfort over confrontation. You've probably experienced this in micro moments. You're telling a story, and she cuts you off to fix it. You express an idea, and she rolls her eyes instead of engaging. You set a boundary, and she laughs like you're joking. None of these alone feel relationship ending, but they accumulate, and accumulated disrespect changes how you carry yourself over time. The real damage isn't what she says, it's what you allow. The more you allow it, the more your internal standard lowers. And once your internal standard lowers, everything else follows. Your posture shifts, your tone shifts. You start negotiating your own expectations just to keep peace. Peace that costs self-respect isn't peace. It's slow surrender. There's something you need to understand clearly. A woman who values you does not consistently position herself above you. She may disagree, she may challenge, she may even confront you. But the underlying tone will be respect. If the underlying tone feels like competition, mockery, or quiet contempt, that is not misunderstanding. That is misalignment. A lot of men stay because they believe love can override disrespect. It cannot. Love without respect becomes resentment. Resentment grows quietly. It shows up in your energy before it shows up in your words. You become less enthusiastic, less expressive, less patient. And then one day she says you've changed. You haven't changed. You've eroded. Another sign that should make you pay attention is inconsistency in loyalty during tension. When conflict arises, does she protect the relationship or does she weaponize vulnerability? Does she threaten to leave over small disagreements? Does she flirt with emotional alternatives when she's upset? Does she broadcast your private matters to outsiders instead of addressing them with you? That pattern isn't emotional immaturity. It's lack of alignment. You might think you can correct it through communication. And communication matters. But here's the hard truth. If someone repeatedly chooses behaviors that lower your standing in their life, despite conversations, despite patience, despite clarity, they are showing you where you rank. And ranking matters. Because no man thrives in a relationship where he is consistently beneath the emotional hierarchy. You've probably told yourself that she's just expressive, that she's passionate, that she doesn't mean it the way it sounds. But intent does not erase impact. If her words repeatedly land with disrespect and she shows no sustained effort to adjust, that tells you everything. Patterns reveal character, not apologies. There's also a form of disrespect that hides in neglect, not obvious neglect, subtle disengagement. When she invests heavily in everyone else but gives you the leftovers, when she dresses up for attention outside but becomes casual and dismissive at home, when she demands emotional labor from you but offers minimal in return. You feel it. You just don't want to call it what it is. And here's where many men get trapped. They compare their situation to worse scenarios. She's not cheating. She's not screaming daily. She's not physically aggressive. So you downgrade your expectations to match the absence of extreme dysfunction. But the absence of chaos does not equal the presence of respect. You need to pay attention to how she speaks about you when you're not present. Do her friends view you as strong because of how she describes you, or as a joke because of how she frames you? That doesn't happen by accident. A woman who respects you protects your image even when you're not there to hear it. A woman who doesn't will subtly undermine you for social validation. This isn't about dominance, it's about dignity. If she consistently positions herself as superior, smarter, more capable, more emotionally evolved, without honoring your strengths equally, she is not building with you. She is competing with you. And competition inside a relationship destroys unity quietly. I want you to think about the last time she dismissed your feelings. Did she pause and consider them? Or did she redirect the conversation back to herself? Emotional invalidation over time creates isolation. You start keeping things inside because sharing feels pointless. That emotional shutdown isn't maturity. It's defense. Another form of disrespect shows up in how she handles your boundaries. When you say something matters to you, does she lean in or brush it aside? If she consistently tests the limits you set, laughs at them, or calls you insecure for having them, that's not misunderstanding. That's defiance. And defiance in a relationship dynamic signals imbalance. The reason this matters so much is because the longer you tolerate imbalance, the harder it becomes to correct. Early disrespect is easier to address. Sustained disrespect becomes identity. She starts seeing you as the man who tolerates it. And once that image locks in, changing it requires drastic action. If you've been nodding quietly while listening to this, don't just internalize it. Engage with it. Comment what you've tolerated in the past that you shouldn't have, not to relive it, but to confront it. Awareness breaks repetition. Silence repeats it. You deserve partnership, not position beneath. You deserve alignment, not quiet competition. And the hardest realization is that sometimes walking away isn't dramatic. It's disciplined. It's the moment you decide that your standard matters more than comfort. This chapter isn't about encouraging impulsive exits. It's about sharpening your perception. Disrespect doesn't start loud. It starts subtle. And if you catch it early, you save yourself years of erosion. If you ignore it, you wake up one day wondering how you became smaller in a relationship that was supposed to build you. And if she consistently makes you feel diminished instead of strengthened, the answer isn't more patience. It's clarity. Chapter 2. You don't leave because of one bad day. You don't leave because she snapped once or had an emotional week. Everybody has moments. Everybody gets overwhelmed. The problem isn't emotion. The problem is pattern. And what most men struggle with is distinguishing between a moment and a rhythm. If disrespect becomes rhythm, you're not in a relationship. You're in a slow negotiation of your own value. There's a specific type of behavior that should make you pause immediately, and it's when she speaks to you with contempt, not frustration. Contempt. There's a difference. Frustration sounds heated but invested. Contempt sounds cold and superior. It's the eye roll, the sarcastic tone, the way she says your name like it's a burden. You feel it in your stomach. And if you've ever felt that feeling, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Contempt is dangerous because it signals that respect has already eroded internally. Once that internal erosion happens, love doesn't restore it. Effort doesn't restore it. You can't negotiate your way back into someone's admiration, and admiration is foundational. Without admiration, everything becomes transactional. You start doing things to earn back warmth instead of operating from mutual regard. That's not healthy. That's survival. You've probably been in a situation where you caught yourself trying harder after she disrespected you. Buying more, texting more thoughtfully, trying to smooth things over. You thought effort would restore balance. But what it actually did was reinforce that she could dip in respect and you would compensate. That dynamic is corrosive. Another sign that you need to stop and reassess is when she minimizes your accomplishments or subtly competes with them. You tell her about progress you made, and instead of celebrating it, she redirects the spotlight or downplays it. Maybe she says you're doing too much or that you think you're better than everyone. That's not playful teasing. That's resentment forming under the surface. A woman aligned with you is proud of your growth because your growth elevates the shared environment. A woman threatened by your growth will subtly attempt to level you down. And if you ignore that, if you keep shrinking to make her comfortable, you lose more than the relationship. You lose momentum. There's also the kind of disrespect that hides inside emotional manipulation. When she uses guilt as leverage, when she reframes your boundaries as selfishness, when she weaponizes tears to avoid accountability. This isn't about dismissing emotions. It's about recognizing patterns of avoidance. If every time you hold her accountable, she shifts into victim mode, you are being trained not to speak up. And once you stop speaking up, you stop being fully present. You need to ask yourself something uncomfortable. Do you feel lighter when she's not around? That question alone can reveal more than hours of analysis. If her absence brings relief more often than longing, something is wrong. Relief means tension has been normalized, and tension should not be baseline in something that's supposed to build you. Disrespect also shows up in how she handles other men around you, not jealousy tactics, not insecurity, just basic conduct. If she entertains flirtation publicly while dismissing your discomfort, that's not freedom, that's disregard. You shouldn't have to beg for consideration. Consideration is automatic when someone values you. You might tell yourself that modern relationships are different, that expectations are evolving. But dignity isn't outdated. Mutual regard isn't old-fashioned. And if she treats the attention of other men like a resource while expecting your loyalty to be absolute, that imbalance will rot the connection from the inside. There's a subtle but powerful difference between a woman who enjoys attention and one who prioritizes your partnership. Attention-seeking in excess is insecurity masked as confidence. If she constantly needs validation from outside the relationship, she's signaling that internal validation from you isn't enough. And that may not be fixable by effort alone. Another dangerous pattern is chronic disrespect disguised as humor. If she repeatedly jokes about your income, your ambitions, your appearance, your past mistakes, and brushes it off as just playing, that's not playful, that's passive aggression. Humor should bond, not belittle. And if you consistently feel like the punchline, you're not in a partnership, you're in a performance. Let's talk about something most men avoid acknowledging. If she consistently disregards your time, that's disrespect. Chronic lateness, last-minute cancellations without accountability, treating your schedule as flexible while hers is sacred. That imbalance isn't accidental, it's prioritization revealed. You make time for what you value. If she repeatedly shows you that your time is negotiable, believe her. I want you to imagine something clearly. Imagine your younger brother or your closest friend describing these behaviors in his relationship. Would you tell him to stay patient, or would you quietly know he deserves better? Sometimes you need to step outside your own attachment to see truth. You don't leave out of ego. You leave out of self-respect. And self-respect isn't loud. It doesn't scream ultimatums. It observes, decides, and acts. The more you tolerate subtle disrespect, the more it becomes normalized. And normalized disrespect is the breeding ground for deeper betrayal later. If this is resonating, don't just listen passively. Share it with someone who keeps making excuses for treatment they know doesn't feel right, not to start chaos, to spark clarity. Because once you see patterns clearly, you stop romanticizing potential. The truth is, women test standards unconsciously. If you hold them calmly, they adjust. If you lower them repeatedly, they recalibrate downward. And once that recalibration becomes habit, restoring balance becomes exponentially harder. The moment you feel consistent dismissal, condescension, or emotional hierarchy positioning you beneath her, you need to pause. Not argue, not escalate. Pause and evaluate, because sometimes leaving isn't dramatic. It's the quietest decision you ever make, and it's also the one that preserves who you are. Chapter 3. There's a point where you stop asking whether she loves you and start asking whether she respects you, and that shift alone tells you everything. Because love without respect turns into control, turns into criticism, turns into subtle dominance disguised as concern. And if you've ever felt like you were being managed instead of partnered with, you already know what I'm talking about. One of the clearest signals that it's time to leave is when she consistently rewrites reality during conflict. Not misunderstanding. Rewriting. You say something plainly, and she reframes it into something extreme. You explain your boundary, and she calls it insecurity. You describe how something made you feel, and she says you're being dramatic. That constant distortion chips away at your confidence over time. You start questioning your own memory. You start double-checking your tone. You start hesitating before speaking. That's not healthy friction. That's psychological erosion. And here's the dangerous part. It rarely feels catastrophic in the moment. It feels confusing, subtle, like you just can't quite land the conversation. But if every disagreement ends with you apologizing just to restore calm, you need to recognize what's happening. Apologizing to keep peace is different from apologizing because you were wrong. One builds humility, the other builds imbalance. A woman who consistently avoids accountability will drain you long before she betrays you. Because the energy required to maintain equilibrium around someone who refuses responsibility is exhausting. You start carrying emotional weight that isn't yours. You start fixing problems you didn't create. You start adjusting tone to avoid backlash. That constant calibration wears you down. There's another behavior that should immediately put you on alert. When she deliberately withholds affection or intimacy as punishment. Not natural shifts in mood, not genuine need for space, punishment. If affection becomes a bargaining chip instead of a shared experience, the relationship has already shifted into power play. And power play erodes connection. You might try to rationalize it. You might think she's just upset. But when patterns of withholding become consistent responses to disagreement, it's not about emotion anymore. It's about leverage. And if someone needs leverage to feel secure, you're not in a partnership. You're in negotiation. You also need to pay attention to how she responds when you succeed. Does she celebrate loudly? Or does she become distant? Sometimes disrespect hides in insecurity. When your growth threatens her comfort zone, she might subtly diminish your momentum. That's not always malicious, but it is revealing. If your upward movement creates tension instead of unity, you're misaligned. And then there's loyalty under pressure, not casual loyalty. Loyalty when it's inconvenient. Loyalty when she's upset with you. Loyalty when other people are watching. If she vents about you publicly instead of protecting the relationship privately, that's not transparency. That's exposure. And exposure creates vulnerability you can't control. I've seen men stay in relationships where their partner would tear them down in front of friends, then act affectionate in private. That split behavior is dangerous because you start living two realities, one where you're respected behind closed doors and one where you're diminished socially. Over time, that social erosion changes how others perceive you, and perception shapes reality more than most people admit. Let me give you one story. And this is the only one I'll use because it captures everything clearly. A guy I knew was in a relationship for years. On the surface, things seemed fine. They lived together, shared routines, smiled in photos. But privately, she dismissed his ideas constantly, mocked his ambitions subtly, told her friends he was still figuring himself out while praising other men's drive. Every time he confronted it, she said he was being sensitive. So, he shrank, stopped sharing plans, stopped expressing growth. Over time, he became quieter, less confident. Eventually, she left him for someone she described as more decisive. What changed wasn't his ambition. It was how much disrespect he tolerated, and that tolerance reshaped him. That story matters because it shows you something important. Disrespect doesn't just hurt feelings, it alters identity. The longer you stay in it, the more you adapt downward. You become less bold, less expressive, less certain. And when you lose certainty, you lose presence. There's a difference between compromise and surrender. Compromise preserves identity. Surrender dissolves it. If you find yourself surrendering core parts of who you are just to maintain harmony, you need to reassess. Harmony that requires self-erasure isn't harmony, it's containment. Another behavior that should make you leave is chronic comparison. If she constantly measures you against other men, whether celebrities, co-workers, or exes, the comparison signals dissatisfaction. You are not in competition with imaginary standards. A woman who respects you values you for who you are, not how closely you resemble someone else. You also need to watch how she handles your vulnerability. If you open up about something personal and she uses it against you later in conflict, that's not immaturity. That's breach of trust. Vulnerability is sacred currency. If someone weaponizes it, the relationship is structurally unsafe, and unsafe relationships breed guarded men. Guarded men cannot thrive emotionally. Take a moment right now and ask yourself honestly, do you feel stronger in this relationship, or do you feel slightly diminished? The answer might not be loud, it might be quiet, but it's there. And that quiet answer is more honest than any argument you've ever had. If you've tolerated behaviors like this because you were afraid of being alone, understand something clearly. Being alone with your standards intact is healthier than being partnered in erosion. Loneliness fades. Disrespect compounds. If this chapter is uncomfortable, that's intentional. Discomfort often signals truth. Don't rush past it. Sit with it. Share it with someone who keeps justifying treatment that's shrinking them. Because clarity spreads faster than denial. You don't leave because she's imperfect. You leave when patterns consistently lower your standing, your voice, your dignity. And the sooner you recognize that, the less of yourself you have to rebuild later. Chapter 4. There's a version of you that existed before you started tolerating certain things. More certain, more grounded, more expressive. And sometimes you don't even realize how much you've shifted until you look back and notice you laugh less, speak less boldly, hesitate more. That kind of quiet change doesn't happen overnight. It happens through repeated small concessions you convinced yourself were harmless. One of the clearest signals that it's time to leave is when you start policing yourself to avoid her reactions, not adjusting respectfully. Policing. You measure your words carefully, not out of maturity, but out of fear. You avoid topics that might trigger her criticism. You suppress opinions that might invite dismissal. That internal censorship is not growth, it's containment. A relationship should expand your ability to express yourself, not shrink it. If you constantly feel like you're walking through conversational landmines, something is wrong. And when that tension becomes baseline, you normalize anxiety. Anxiety becomes routine. Routine becomes identity. That's how erosion becomes permanent. There's another form of disrespect that often gets disguised as independence, when she makes unilateral decisions that impact both of you without consultation, not because she forgot, because she didn't feel the need to include you. That subtle exclusion signals something deeper than autonomy. It signals hierarchy. If she consistently acts as if your input is optional, You're not in partnership. You're adjacent to it. And then there's emotional favoritism. When she prioritizes everyone else's needs while treating yours as flexible. She shows up for friends instantly, but delays showing up for you. She invests emotionally in coworkers but seems distant when you need support. That imbalance isn't accidental. It reflects where you sit in her internal priority list. You need to ask yourself something without defensiveness. When you express dissatisfaction, does she listen with curiosity or respond with counterattack? If every complaint you raise is met with, "Well, you do this too," the relationship is no longer about resolution. It's about deflection, and deflection kills progress. There's a dangerous dynamic that forms when you become the only one working to improve things. You initiate conversations, you seek therapy, you suggest solutions, you research communication styles, and she participates passively or reluctantly. Improvement cannot be one-sided. Effort without reciprocity breeds quiet resentment. Another sign that leaving might be necessary is when apologies become routine, but change never follows. Words are cheap. Patterns are expensive. If she repeatedly says she understands, promises adjustment, and then returns to the same behavior, she's showing you that comfort outweighs growth. And if comfort outweighs growth consistently, stagnation follows. Disrespect also shows up in how she handles your ambition. If she mocks your discipline, questions your grind, or subtly suggests you're doing too much instead of encouraging you, she may not be aligned with your trajectory. Alignment matters. Because if your life is expanding and hers is anchored in comfort, tension will increase. And if that tension turns into criticism, you're building with friction instead of fuel. You may try to compromise by shrinking your pace, by slowing your ambition to match her comfort, but every time you shrink to maintain peace, you trade potential for temporary harmony. And temporary harmony built on self-reduction always collapses eventually. Let's talk about emotional intimidation. If she raises her voice to overpower you, if she escalates conflict quickly to regain control, if she uses silence strategically to create anxiety in you, these behaviors aren't random. They are control mechanisms, and control masquerading as passion is still control. A relationship built on emotional intimidation trains you to self-regulate for survival instead of connection. You become reactive to her moods. You adjust plans to avoid volatility. You anticipate tension before it happens. That hypervigilance drains you. And drained men cannot lead effectively in any area of life. There's also the slow decay that comes from lack of admiration. If she no longer looks at you with pride, if her compliments feel forced or rare, if she rarely acknowledges your growth but quickly highlights your mistakes, something has shifted internally for her. And once admiration fades deeply enough, rebuilding it is nearly impossible without drastic change. Take a second and reflect. When was the last time she genuinely praised your character without prompting? Not your looks, not your resources, your character. If that question makes you pause, pay attention to the silence that follows. Silence often answers more honestly than memory. I want you to consider something uncomfortable. Sometimes we stay because we've invested time, years, shared memories, joint plans. But time invested does not justify continued erosion. Past effort does not obligate future tolerance. That belief traps more men than fear of being alone ever could. If you've been listening and quietly recognizing pieces of your own situation, don't brush that aside. Write it down, say it out loud, acknowledge it. Because clarity weakens denial. And denial is what keeps you in patterns long after they've stopped serving you. The truth is, leaving isn't always explosive. Sometimes it's the quietest decision you make. You wake up one day and realize the cost of staying exceeds the cost of rebuilding. And rebuilding, while painful, restores something staying never will. Yourself. If this chapter feels heavy, that's okay. Weight forces reflection. Share this with someone who needs to confront hard truths instead of romanticizing discomfort. Sometimes growth comes from recognizing when to close a door. And closing a door doesn't make you weak. It makes you decisive. The real question isn't whether she has flaws. Everyone does. The real question is whether those flaws consistently lower your standing and spirit. If the answer is yes, then staying isn't loyalty, it's self-betrayal. And no relationship is worth that cost. Chapter 5. There's a quiet kind of clarity that settles in when you finally admit to yourself that something isn't right. Not dramatic, not explosive, just clear. You stop arguing internally. You stop rehearsing conversations in your head. You stop trying to explain her behavior in ways that make it easier to swallow. And in that stillness, you realize you've been holding the relationship together more than you've been held inside it. That realization changes how you breathe. At some point, you have to ask yourself a question without flinching. If this dynamic continued exactly as it is for the next 5 years, would you be proud of the man you become inside it? That question cuts deeper than any argument. Because it's not about whether she's bad. It's about whether the environment you're in is building you or bending you. And bending slowly can feel like normal life until you notice you don't recognize your own reflection emotionally. A woman who consistently disrespects you doesn't always do it loudly. Sometimes it's the absence of warmth when you need it. Sometimes it's the casual dismissal of your priorities. Sometimes it's how easily she speaks over you when others are present. Sometimes it's how quickly she criticizes you in private but praises herself in public. These micro-fractures create distance. And distance, when it's one-sided, becomes isolation. You may have convinced yourself that leaving would mean failure, that it would mean you didn't try hard enough, that real men stay and fight through friction. But there's a difference between friction that sharpens and friction that erodes. One makes you stronger, the other makes you smaller. And if you're honest, you already know which one you've been experiencing. One of the hardest things to accept is that sometimes a woman reveals who she is not through betrayal, but through indifference. Indifference to your boundaries, indifference to your discomfort, indifference to your growth. Indifference is colder than anger, because anger at least signals investment. Indifference signals detachment, and detachment without repair leads nowhere healthy. There's also a kind of disrespect that shows up in how she reacts to your absence. If you pull back slightly to regain balance, and she doesn't notice, doesn't care, doesn't recalibrate, that tells you something profound. Because a woman who values your presence feels its shift. If she remains unaffected consistently, your role in her emotional structure may not be what you believed it was. And that's painful. But pain is information. You might be afraid that leaving means starting over, rebuilding routines, facing loneliness, explaining to friends, untangling shared plans. But staying in quiet erosion also means starting over eventually, just with more damage to repair. The difference is whether you choose the timing or let the timing choose you. Ask yourself this gently. When you imagine your future, does she feel like a multiplier or a weight? Not in finances, not in convenience, in spirit. Does her presence amplify your confidence or chip at it? Do you feel admired or managed? Do you feel partnered or corrected? Those questions matter more than how long you've been together. You don't leave to punish her. You leave to preserve you. And preservation is not selfish. It's necessary. Because once self-respect drops below a certain threshold, rebuilding it becomes much harder than maintaining it. Every time you swallow something that violates your standard, that threshold lowers. Eventually, you forget where it used to be. If you've ever felt relief when imagining life without the tension, that relief is telling you something. Relief is your nervous system recognizing safety and separation. That doesn't mean you act impulsively. It means you pay attention, you evaluate honestly instead of emotionally. You stop defending the relationship more than you defend yourself. There will always be moments of doubt when you consider walking away. You'll remember good times. You'll question whether you're being too rigid. You'll wonder if you should try one more time. But ask yourself something steady. Have the patterns truly shifted? Or have you just adjusted your tolerance? Adjustment without change is surrender disguised as patience. If this video has felt less like advice and more like a mirror, that's intentional. Because deep down, you already know the answer to your situation. You just needed language to frame it. And language sharpens decision-making. Decision-making restores power. You deserve a woman who speaks to you with pride, who protects your image in rooms you're not in, who listens when you express discomfort, who aligns with your ambition instead of competing with it, who handles conflict without humiliation. If that feels like too much to ask, check your standards, because those are not luxuries, those are basics. Take a moment right now and reflect without distraction. Not what you hope she'll become, not what she used to be, what she consistently is. Patterns reveal truth more than promises ever will. And once truth becomes undeniable, the only question left is whether you're brave enough to act on it. If this resonated deeply, hit the like button so this message reaches men who are silently tolerating more than they admit. Share it with someone who needs clarity instead of comfort. And subscribe if you're serious about raising your standards instead of lowering them for convenience. Because conversations like this aren't about drama, they're about dignity. Sometimes leaving is the most respectful thing you can do for both of you. It ends the slow resentment. It stops the erosion. It forces growth on both sides. And while it may hurt temporarily, pain from truth heals faster than comfort from denial. At the end of the day, if your woman consistently disrespects you, minimizes you, undermines you, or drains your confidence, leaving isn't extreme, it's disciplined. And disciplined men build lives where respect is not negotiable.